خوفي منه معادلة النيران أكثر شيء بزعجني.
قذيفة.
اخواتي ماتوا لما انضربت. رفيقتي فاطمة وسيدرا وولاء.
إنه ما بتوقف هون الحياة.
طبت قذيفة، صوبت في ظهري، أثرت لي شيء بالنصف.
بتخيل إنه رجعت أمشي على إجراي مثل أولي وأركض، وسجلت في نادي حديد.
Went from there all the way to here.
So here I am basically on a bicycle after 3 years.
بتخيل حياتي إنه صرت أمسي.
شو ما كان وضعي أنا لازم أكمل وأشتغل، بستمتع بالحياة.
Hello everyone, welcome to today's virtual field trip and the press briefing on the situation of the children of Syria and in the region. It has been 10 years since the start of the conflict in Syria. Welcome again, my name is Juliette Touma and I'm the Regional Chief of Communications in the Unicef Middle East and North Africa Regional Office. I will be presenting in both English and Arabic. So before we continue, I would like to highlight that Arabic translation is available on this briefing. You will see the function at the bottom of the screen that says interpretation. So you can just go there and select Arabic. You can always put your questions in the Q&A function and we will answer those towards the end of this press briefing. We opened our briefing today with Syrian children's voices with whom UNICEF worked over the past decade. We will be closing this briefing with a series of short videos, profiles of some of those children, so please stay with us. After 10 years of conflict, the Syria crisis continues to have a huge impact on children inside Syria, across the sub-region and beyond. Every Syrian child has been impacted by violence, displacement, their families broken apart, and a lack of access to basic services, including schools and hospitals. The COVID-19 pandemic has made it much, much worse. Today, we'll be taking you inside Syria to see the impact the war has had on children and UNICEF's work in education, health and nutrition, and water and sanitation. We will also cross to neighboring Jordan, which hosts a huge number of refugees, including refugees from Syria. Happy to introduce Ted Shaiban, the UNICEF Regional Director for the Middle East and North Africa, who recently visited Syria, where he met with families and children. He's been on numerous visits to Syria and has been working on the Syria file for many, many years. In fact, almost since the beginning. Ted, you recently visited Syria and you went to Al-Hol camp in Northeast Syria. We'll be hearing from you later on our program, and you will be available to answer your questions. You'll be available to answer our questions or the questions of our friends from the media in the Q&A session. Great to have you with us, Ted, today.
Thank you, Juliette. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much, Ted. We're now going to start, our friends, we're going to start our virtual field trip to Syria. Our first stop is Aleppo. Aleppo is a UNESCO World Heritage Site that has now largely been destroyed by the decade-long conflict. UNICEF continues to work in the area to help get children back into learning. UNICEF is also working there to provide psychological support to children emotionally scarred by the conflict. We will then cross to our colleagues in the Fafin camp in North Rural Aleppo, where UNICEF has been working to provide water and sanitation to nearly 4,000 people.
welcome to Aleppo. My name is Khalf. I am the chief of Aleppo Field Office. Today you are joining us to see the impact of Unicef work on the children in Aleppo. You will be traveling to a school, to a community center. Then we will be going to northern rural of Aleppo in order to see Fafin camp, where we have internally displaced people. My colleague Antoine will be with you during your visit. Antoine.
Thank you, Isra. Hello, everyone. I'm Antoine Shennikji, the Communication Officer at Unicef Aleppo. I hope today you will have an informative and interesting visit with us. So we reached Bab in Nisreen area, and we're going to visit Khawla Bint Al-Azwar school. But first, let me introduce you to my colleague, Osama Antebi. He's our education officer.
You're most welcome to Aleppo. Let's go. Now we are going through one of Aleppo 9 gates. It's called Nisreen Gate. It's like 900 years old. In UNICEF, we usually do school rehabilitation for 2 main reasons. The first one is the need for learning space. And the second one is to prepare the school and to attract people and returnees to come back to their hometown or their neighborhoods and communities. In this area, we have the 2 reasons. So I believe that people will come back one day here to rebuild and recover their life before crisis. When we visited this school in 2017, we found 50 children in the school only. Now we're talking about more than 200 children in the same school. That means people are coming back despite of the lack of the basic services like electricity, power, and water network. Even you cannot find your way here in the darkness during the night. It was so difficult to find your way during the past years here. When we started working in this school, this road, for example, was full of debris, stones, war remnants, sometimes UXOs. We tried to advocate for the children's right to be safe while they're going to school, with the municipalities, with the governor office. And as you see now, they can find their way. It's better. This is Khawla Bint Al-Azwar School, which was rehabilitated in 2017. We usually, when do rehabilitation, we establish early childhood education, ECE, we call it ECE, room in each school that we rehabilitate. So let's have a visit and have a look at this ECE room. مرحبا، شلونكم؟ الله يعطيكم العافية. أسألكم سؤال، معلش. هلا كلكم هون بيوتكم قريبة من هون من المدرسة؟ مين بيته شوي بعيد؟ وين بيتك حضرتك؟ إيه؟ أيوة؟ نفس المنطقة. تعتبر نفس المنطقة. مستعمل الأصل يعني تعتبر. بنت للأنسلة. تمام. إيه حبيبي قول. وين بيتكم؟ بالجلوم كلهم. بالجلوم.
الشكل. برافو صفي الدعم. وهذا الشكل الوجه.
To ensure inclusion for all children, even children with disabilities, UNICEF is supporting the resource rooms that have the needed support from trained teachers for those children to be included in the same schools. Let's have a visit at those resource centers. مرحبا، شلونكن؟ شلونك يا أنسي؟ احكي لي ايش عم تعمل عمار؟
والله بلعب.
هذا لعب تسلاي. طب نسمع من أنسي ايش هذا النشاط اللي عم يعملوه الشباب؟
نشاط الالوان. هو عنده شويه ضعف بالالوان.
كويس.
ندرب له بشكل حسي
كثير منيح
ولمسي، كمان عنده الادراك الحركي عنده شوي ضعيف.
مجموعة طلاب ذوي الاحتياجات الخاصة اللي عم ندعمهم بالمدرسة واللي بنفس الوقت عم يحضروا دروس مع زملائهم
10 ضمن 8 صفوف.
ضمن 8 صفوف، وكل حالة مختلفة عن الثانية.
كل حالة مختلفة عن الثانية، كل وحدة لها توصيف وإلها طرائقة وإلها خطتها.
تمام.
كذلك مع عظمة حجم. إذا نحن لما نتحدث عن البحر أول شيء
We are now at Al Maadi neighborhood. We're going to see UNICEF multi-server platform. But first, let me introduce you to my colleague, Yasser Ahmedi. Yasser?
Hello, this is Yasser Ahmedi. I'm Education Officer with UNICEF. I have been working with UNICEF since 2013. We are going to see one of the most important interventions of UNICEF in Aleppo city. We selected this neighborhood to establish the community center after we have done the rapid assessment in 2017-2018 after the area became accessible for us as UNICEF. The multi-service platform here provide education and child protection to the local community and to the surrounding community, to the children who are coming from nearby neighborhoods to this community center. As you can see, this neighborhood is relatively damaged and there are a lot of destruction. Children used to be out of school for years because of the displacement, because of the security reasons, because of the conflicts before the area became accessible to us. Also, this multi-service platform provide like an only opportunity to children to attend non-formal education. So as you see, this signboard to the center indicates that all services here in the center are free. Here in the center, we provide early childhood education service, which is also targeting the children at the age of 3 up to 6 years old. Actually, this program was like a candle of hope for the community here because it's free of charge and the families finally have a chance to send their children for an early education, which is relatively impossible for them because of the economic situation and the financial crisis that they have and the country entirely have now. صباح الخير. So now we are going to meet children and we'll meet the volunteers who are working with us. They will talk more about the services and what they have here. Come on. صباح الخير. مرحبا.
صباح الخير. صباح النور.
كيفكم؟ شو الأخبار؟
تمام الحمد لله. أهلا وسهلا. وسهلا.
كيف أمورك؟ صباح الخير.
صباح الخير. أهلا وسهلا.
كيف الأوضاع؟ تمام؟
تمام الحمد لله. صباح الخير.
شو في عندنا اليوم اكتيفيتيز شغالين الصبح؟
إيه أهلا وسهلا تفضلوا.
صباح الخير. صباح الخير. مرحبا. صباح الخير. كيفكم؟ شو الأخبار؟ شو عم تاخذوا اليوم؟
عن جهاز تنفس، جهاز دوران.
ممتاز. طيب شو استفدتوا؟ شو احكي لي شو استفدتوا؟
كنت ما بعرف أكتب بقى صرت أعرف شوي.
كويس، كمان؟
صرت أعرف شوي.
رحت شيء على المدرسة تسجل من جديد ولا ما عاد رحت على المدرسة نهائيا؟
ما رحت.
ليه؟
ليه ما بفهم شيء.
طيب شو خطتك بعد ما تخلص هون المستوى؟ شو رح تعمل؟
بشتغل.
بدك تشتغل؟ ليه؟
ليه؟
ما بدك تكمل دراسة؟ بدك؟ ولا للتاسع ولا للبكالوريا ولا
بس التاسع.
ليش ما بدك تكمل درس؟
ليه؟ أتعلم مصلحة.
ايش في بالك المصلحة؟
خياط.
في حدا بالعائلة بيشتغل خياط؟
كلهم
بيشتغلوا خياط؟ كله عم بيشتغل؟
بس أنا هاي الجمعة.
هاي الجمعة وقفت. طيب أنت عم تشتغل؟
إيه.
شو عم تشتغل أنت؟
خياط.
خياط، أنت شو عم تشتغل؟
خياط.
شو عم كمان خياط. نجار، هونيك خياط، أنت؟
أنا طباع.
طباع، شو بتطبع؟
أحذية.
أحلى أحذية، وأنت؟ ما بتشتغل؟ عم تروح على المدرسة؟ كل وقتك بالمدرسة؟
هلا ايوه بحب المدرسة.
تحب المدرسة؟ أي صف هلا أنت؟
هلا دخلت على الثامن، بدي أكمل الثامن.
ليش؟
لأني صار عندي لا.
صار بدك دروس تقوية أكثر. طيب أنت شو عم تشتغل؟
معمل نسيج وخياطة.
معمل نسيج وخياطة، لكم زمان عم تشتغلوا؟
أنا بشتغل من عمري 7 سنين.
من 7 سنين. كم ساعة باليوم بتشتغل؟
12.
12 ساعة؟
ليش؟
15 سنة، يعني صار لك 7 سنين عم تشتغل تقريبا.
الصف الأول بطلت، رحت الصف الأول على الصف الثاني بطلت. اشتغلت أول شيء طبيعة، ضليت شهر 6 شهور بعدين رحت على الخياطة.
وكم ساعة بتشتغل باليوم؟
10 ساعات 9 ساعات.
10 ساعات.
بس هلا عم بشتغل 4 ساعات.
4 ساعات. مشان لأنه توفق بين هون وهونيك؟
يعطيكم العافية. موفقين. أنا بدي منكم تشدوا على الدراسة، برافو عليكم كثير إنكم مخصصين وقت لتجوا تدرسوا هون، ولازم كثير نفكر إنه ناخذ شهادة التاسع ونكمل بعده وناخذ البكالوريا. فينا ندرس ونشتغل. أنا وقت كنت قدكم على فكرة كنت أدرس وأشتغل. Children here receive this opportunity to compensate the education they missed out on through the years. Many of them were enrolled in schools, but they left because they don't understand anything from the curriculum. They were put in wrong grades, so they were unable to read and write, but they were like enrolled in grade 6 or grade 8. So here they have the opportunity to start again from the appropriate academic level, so they can compensate and bridge the learning opportunity.
After seeing our education activities, we're now going to see our child protection activities. But first, let me introduce you to my colleague, Ms. Nurhan Mahjoub.
Hi, I am Nurhan. I am from Aleppo and I work for Unicef Aleppo field office for around 7 years. I am the child protection officer, and now I am going to tell you about what type of child protection activities we are implementing in this center. First of all, we have another 4 centers similar to this one and run by the same partner. In this center, we provide psychosocial support activities for the children, which is 16 sessions that the child needs to attend through 2 months. And in these sessions, they learn about their feelings and how they can react with their feelings, how to deal with their peers, but also with the other adults, and they learn about how they deal with the routine and usual stress and what they want to become in the future. Let's go in and attend the activity with the children. It's their 11th session. Yalla, let's go.
بس نتأكد إنه ما ضل يطلع عنا كلمات. هون بعدين صار معنا حروف. هون كمان.
This corner is for children who is coming out of their scheduled time for activities, so they are free to attend kind of recreational activities that is observed by a facilitator. So we can come in and see what they are drawing here. البيت اللي بدك ترسميه البيت اللي بدك ترسميه هو بيتكم نفسه ولا البيت اللي حابة تسكني فيه؟ حابة تسكني فيه.
Before we move to Fafin, let us pick up our colleagues Maher and Hussam. Maher will show us Unicef Intervention here. Come on. Maher, Hussam.
Hi again, this is Hussam from Health and Nutrition.
Hi again, this is Maher. This project is providing alternative water source through using the Efrat River instead of using the groundwater. The idea is providing pumps on a tunnel that's coming from the Efrat River. Those pumps will pump the water to 4 intake points, and those intake points give the water to the water tankers that take the water to Fafin and the camps in the rural that we are going to visit in a while. The good idea of this project that it saved using the groundwater and saved using the fuel, the labor that is needed to operate 200 water wells that already exist in Aleppo. Hey, this is the Fafin camp. This camp was established in March 2018, where around 137 people, 137,000 people displaced from Afrin district due to military action. This camp consists of 800 tents, hosting around 3,000 individuals. Let's go inside and see the situation in the camp and see the services that is provided by Unicef team and other agencies in the camp. Here UNICEF provided water tanks and toilets, as you can see, taking in consideration the gender issues, issues of protection and safety, were provided solar power for heating the water and providing light in the toilets. Here I will take the opportunity to explain about development that we did in this camp, where we connected all tanks to a network. If you can see this pipe, the green one, going to underground network. So instead of having the tanker going inside the camp between the tents, with all the risk of having children around the tanker, this intervention is to prevent tankers from going inside. And the people can fetch water, as you can see from that point. Each 3 tents, there is one point to collect water. Also, one of the good points to mention that to prevent, the water, any water point needs drainage connection. So to prevent having muddy spots between the tents, we connected all those points into drainage, proper drainage system. صباح الخير. شلونكم؟ ايش الطبخة اليوم؟ بطاطا كثير طيبة. أين صف أنتو؟
أنا الصف التاسع.
عم تروحي على المدرسة؟
لا
ليش؟
عطلة.
عطلة. وأنت أين صف؟
4.
أنت أختها؟
إيه.
إيه. حلو هون ولا ما حلو؟
حلو.
ما له حلو، إن شاء الله بنرجع على بيوتنا، إن شاء الله يا رب. الله يعطيكم العافية.
صحفين.
شكرا.
This is also one of the services provided inside the camp, which is the dislodging of sewage water. This is on daily basis. We pump the water from the manhole and then we pump it again in the municipal system, because there is no municipal system inside the camp nor around the camp. So the only solution is to provide daily dislodging to get rid of the sewage water. Hi, Hassan.
Hi.
So please take the lead. Explain to us about the health intervention.
Hello again. Now we will talk about the health situation in this camp. This emergency affected the health situation for children and mothers through different aspects like seasonal diseases or seasonal infections, like diarrhea waves in summer and respiratory infections in winter, like this situation. In addition to malnutrition among children and mothers, and also the children who are dropped out from the immunization program. مرحبا. الفريق عم يمسح الفريق عم يسمعوا بيجوا لهون وبياخذوا بعد بيجوا سكويز وبحط الاطفال بعدها. So the nutrition mobile team of volunteers is training children and mothers inside the tents, and then refer the children and mothers to this point to receive their nutrition supplies. So now we are going to see the outreach volunteers team screening children and mothers for acute malnutrition. Let's go. مرحبا، يعطيكم العافية. بس نتعرف على أسمائهم؟ لا أسماء الشباب. So Abdul Qadir and Lubna are members of the outreach volunteers team. They are doing the nutritional screening through mock assessment through this tape. They assess the nutritional situation for children under 5 years through measuring the circumference of the mid-upper arm, and then referring children according to their situation to the point to receive their supplies. Abdul Qadir is now measuring the amount. His mark is 16.8 centimeters. He is normal. Now he is going to be referred to the point to receive preventive nutrition supplies.
And that concludes our visit for today. We tried to show you different UNICEF's aspects of work here in Aleppo, from emergency to life-saving. We really enjoyed having you here with us, and I hope someday we meet in person here in Aleppo. See you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, colleagues, and thanks to the UNICEF team in Syria, and in particular, the team in Aleppo for this very good field trip. I hope you've enjoyed this and see how important it is, the work that's being done on the ground. I think it's so important to see how we're able to make a difference despite the global COVID-19 pandemic. I felt I was back in Aleppo, this beautiful city in the north of Syria. And I hope that this trip has helped you get a better idea about UNICEF's work in Syria through these excellent colleagues that we have on the ground. So members of the press, colleagues, friends, thank you for coming to this press conference. UNICEF is very grateful for your interest that has been with us over the years. For the past decade, you, the members of the press corps, have been part of the extended UNICEF family through ongoing coverage on the impact of this brutal war. And you've been able to raise attention, you've been able to help us advocate, you've been able to make us make a difference. 10 years, it's a whole decade, it's a half a generation. It's beyond belief that this has been going on that long. This has been a war that has had a staggering impact on every single child from Syria. When the war first started, I traveled with a group of emergency directors to Syria. And at the time, we aimed to expand humanitarian action in Syria by conducting the first cross-line mission. As you know, Syria pre-2011 was a middle-income country with almost no humanitarian response. So we had to gear up. And yet none of us at the time thought that the war would go on for 10 years. And yet here we are. This beautiful and diverse country that is Syria has been riddled by one of the most brutal wars in recent history. The toll that the fighting has had on millions of people including more specifically its children, on the mosaic of the social fabric, on the economy, let alone on the infrastructure, including basic services, is tremendous. Let me give you a few points of information or data that could be useful. So firstly, last year has been exceptionally hard for Syria's children with the triple effect of the ongoing war, the economic crisis, and the COVID-19 pandemic. Inside Syria, there are 6.1 million children in need of assistance today. This is an increase of 20%. It's 90% of Syria's children. The price of the average food basket, what a family eats every week, has skyrocketed in the last year. It has increased over 230%. And according to the latest estimate, more than 500,000 children on the age of 5 in Syria suffer from stunting as a result of chronic malnutrition. We saw the catch-up education program going to kind of more formal education. 1 in 3 schools can no longer be used because they were damaged, destroyed, or are being used as shelters for displaced families, or in some cases being used for military purposes. Let me turn to the issue of the fighting, and specifically to the issue of children directly affected by conflict. So according to the latest verified data between 2011 and 2020, more than 12,000 children were verified as killed or injured. The numbers are unfortunately much higher, but this is the direct reports we've received. More than 5,700 children, some as young as 7 years old, were recruited into the fighting. And nearly half of these 5,700 children served in combat roles in the front lines. And more than 1,300 education and medical facilities and personnel came under attack. The war is leaving a heavy toll on children's mental health, with both short and long-term implications. 1 in 4 children are now displaying symptoms of psychosocial distress. And this is double what we had last year. Now, I want to zoom in on one situation of particular concern, the situation in northeast of Syria. You know, I visited northeast Syria in December. I visited Al-Hol camp. And I want to say that the living conditions in the camps are appalling. And while we continue to deliver services there, this camp is not where children should be. There are 41,000 children in Al-Hol, including Syrian children. Of these 41,000 children, there's nearly 27,500 children from 60 nationalities. And these children should not be there. They should be at home with families in their communities or countries of origin. So there's a lot of terrible things that have happened for children over the last decade. But I also want to say that there is hope. My main message to you today is that the children of Syria are far from being a lost generation. Through Syria's children, including the Syrian children that we saw in the videos today, we learn about courage, we learn about perseverance and resolve. The determination of children to learn, overcome the odds, and build a better future is admirable. During my several visits to Syria, I witnessed this firsthand. It's mothers telling us consistently that the most important thing is to get their children education, no matter where they are, who controls the territory where they live, because that's the future. It's children like Saja, who we saw at the beginning, who never gives up despite losing her leg. She continues to play football, as you saw, and she wants to be a sport teacher. What she told us is we cannot let a moment, she cannot let a moment define her life. So we should continue supporting Syria's children wherever they are, inside Syria, in the neighboring countries that have done so much and beyond. And if you allow, let us turn to a second part of the virtual visit to Syria. This is a trip that will take place to the neighboring country of Jordan, and then we'll have an opportunity to discuss and go through your questions. Thank you very much. Back to the
Hello
video.
everyone. Zaatari camp has been home for nearly 80,000 Syrian refugees since 2012. More than half of them are children. One of the most important life-saving services that Unicef provides here in Zaatari camp is clean water supply. So right now we're going to meet my colleague Rajai from Wash section, who's going to explain it all.
UNICEF arranged for disinfection stations at the main gate of the Zaatari camp. And also we never stopped supplying the water to the camp, even from our internal boreholes or external boreholes by trucking. Also during that period we increased the water share per refugee per day. And also we did some distributions, cleaning kits, hygiene kits, and soap distribution, and we increased the water share per person per day from 50 liters to 55 liters.
نحن جينا على المخيم بتاريخ 7/1/2013. بصراحة المي كانت أول ما أجينا على المخيم كثير صعبة، من حيث إنه نضل نركض وراء صهاريج المي وراء التنك المي، لا نعبي، بس إنه كميتنا كانت كثير قليلة. وحاليا الحمد لله بعد ما صارت شبكة المي واصلة للبيوت، وكل بيت صار عنده حنفية وكل بيت عنده شبكة مي، وفي يوم محدد لبين تيجي المي. وحاليا شبكة المي الحمد لله كثير ممتازة، ونشكر منظمة يونيسف لأنها قدمت لنا هاي المياه للبيوت.
One of the other programs that Unicef is doing here in Zaatari is education. It's very important for the children to have a full education. So right now we're going to meet my colleague Osama, who's going to tell us what Unicef has done during COVID-19 lockdown. Osama, how are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Very good. So can you tell me, Osama, during the lockdown period, what Unicef has done?
Sure. I mean, it was critical time, of course, but Unicef wanted to ensure that all students in the camp, children in the camp, have access to educational material. So this varied from providing internet data bundles for around 6,500 families in the camps, providing educational kits with printed material for all students as well, sending WhatsApp messages to all the students as well and their families during this lockdown period, so that students always feel that they're still in touch with their education. All of this material, of course, are user-friendly and allow accessibility for all students, especially with children with disabilities.
That's great, that's great. I'm seeing today that we have a team on the ground. What are they doing?
Sure, it's the Safely Back to School campaign.
Yeah.
What we want to create is a positive environment so that families feel confident sending their kids back to school. So, I mean, during this time, dropout rate might increase. There's a high risk for dropout rate to increase. So what we do usually is, instead of, if this happens, of course, the chances for child labor might increase, early child marriages for girls might increase. So instead of that, we go and visit families. We assure them that actually the school environment is now safe. All health and hygiene measures have been implemented in schools. Training for school staff is also being provided. So we assure them that their kids can go back to school, their education should not stop.
Thank you so much. That was great.
Thank you.
So right now we're here at my favorite place in Zaatari camp. It is the Makani Center, and I'm going to show you in a minute why it's my favorite place. But first, we're going to have to take some safety precautions. Please. Okay. Shukran jazilan.
Makani in Arabic is my space in English. We provide children in Zaatari refugee camp a safe space where we give them learning support services from 6 to 18. We give them psychosocial support and we teach them about their rights. We give them life skills training. We have computer labs where they can access internet inside the camp. And also everything is led by Syrians refugees. This is the most important part, that we give them we empowered everyone inside the camp to manage and to teach and to do everything inside the center. And we're here as myself, I'm here just to give them a technical support where if they have any challenges, we give them the support to find solution as well.
Welcome to Azlak camp, home of 35,000 refugees, of which half of them are children. I've been working with UNICEF for 5 years now. When the government announced the lockdown, I had to rush to the camp, and I went to the nearest shop and bought all the supplies I would need to stay in the camp. The reason for that is because we had to ensure that our life-saving services continued in the camp, and that we are providing all the cleaning and hygiene items that people would need during this period. We're here in the clinic in Village 3, which is supported by UNICEF for children's services such as nutrition and vaccination for children. In addition to the support UNICEF continued providing to the hospitals and clinics in Azlak camp, UNICEF also provided hygiene and cleaning items to the hospitals and to the health workers in hospitals and clinics to make sure everyone has access to hygiene and cleaning supplies to keep everyone safe in the camp. Here we are with the nurse Yusra, and she's been working in Azlak camp in this clinic for the past 1.5 years. So we're providing measles and polio and hepatitis A, among other vaccines in this clinic.
نفس الشيء صبايا نرجع.
We're here in my favorite place in the camp, مكان Youth for Change. It's basically a place for children to get education, to play with each other, and to get child protection services and life skills education as well. So Makani centers and schools in the camp had been closed since March, and Makani has just reopened today. And the children are very thrilled to be here. Thank you for supporting the refugees and children living in the camp. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you to our teams in Jordan for this excellent field trip. Colleagues, UNICEF in Jordan has expanded its operation in response to the refugee influx very early, since late 2012, as the influx of refugee continued. Our teams continue to be there in the camp, as you saw, and across the host communities to deliver aid and assistance to children. And like in Jordan, we have teams in all of the host countries, including Lebanon, Turkey, Iraq, and Egypt. The number of refugee children in neighboring countries has increased more than tenfold since the beginning of the crisis, to 2.5 million Syrian refugee children since 2012. And Syria's neighboring countries, the countries I just mentioned, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Iraq, Egypt, have borne the brunt of this outflow, despite having their own challenges economically. These countries host 83% of the total number of Syrian refugees around the world, putting a strain on them and their services. And this generosity, this open door that people and government in Syria's neighboring countries have shown is exemplary, and it's not to be taken for granted. You know, despite everything, economic crises, political instability, this generosity has never stopped. It continues a decade on. And Syria's neighboring countries themselves need our support more than ever. I have to say I'm specifically concerned that Lebanon gets support. Lebanon's going through a very difficult situation. You remember the explosion in August. And we very much in Lebanon are working not just to support refugee children, but of course the needs of Lebanese children, including through the public education system that caters to both. So again, like I did last time, let me give you a couple of pieces of information on some of the results in this case of UNICEF's work. And this includes our work inside Syria and in neighboring countries. So with UNICEF's support over the last year, nearly 900,000 children have received routine immunization or vaccination against measles. Over 400,000 children have been reached with psychosocial support. I saw a question about that. Much of the videos that you saw, both in Jordan and in Syria, and it would be the same in Lebanon and Turkey, wherever we would take you through this virtual field trip, focuses on the importance of education and learning. And we've been able, with UNICEF support, to access over 3.7 million children who have benefited from formal and non-formal education. Overall, 5 million children are learning as we speak today, and each of those is a ray of hope. We've been able to support 5.4 million people with access to safe water through improvements to water supply system, as you saw in Zatari. And in response to the COVID pandemic, we reached 55 million people with awareness raising materials, health measures, distributed personal protective equipment to frontline workers, including masks, robes, and face shields, and are supporting the countries to get the needed vaccines and get beyond the issue of vaccine nationalism. So what does it all mean? And where do we go forward? I mean, thanks to all the efforts from partners, governments, dedicated personnel, civil society, partners, and of course, teachers, we continue to have 5 million children who have access to learning. And this is an example and an indication of the joint efforts. You know, without the work, without everyone coming together, we would have virtually no children learning in Syria and around Syria, no Syrian child learning. And we would be at risk of a lost generation. You know, in the coming years, we will continue to focus on learning. We'll continue to focus on responding to COVID, including the delivery of vaccines. We will continue focusing on psychosocial support to children and keeping them safe from violence and harm. Returning to the COVID-19 situation for a moment, let me just say that we, with WHO and other organizations, are a member of the COVAX facility. And one of the key things we'll be doing in the weeks ahead is making sure that we facilitate the equitable delivery of vaccines across Syria, including in the northwest of Syria, and that we support host governments, including in neighboring countries, with reaching priority groups, including those among refugees. Jordan is in fact the first country in the world to start vaccinating refugees. All of the neighboring countries have included the refugees in their plans. We need to make sure the follow-up happens, that this is operationalized, that the vaccines go from frontline workers to people with underlying conditions to the elderly, and so on. We hope all countries hosting refugees will follow suit. And we, WHO, and other sister agencies are there to support the countries as they go through this. Colleagues, this concludes our virtual visit. I think we now have a chance to return to some of your questions, and Juliette's going to help us manage this portion of our gathering today. Juliette, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Ted. Thank you, everyone, for sending your questions through. We have received quite a number. So we will start with the first one, which is about the, if you could tell us, Ted, the question is obviously to you, if you could tell us about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on children in camps. Are COVID cases worsening? And what are the supplies and types of assistance that are required? I think you've touched upon some of it in your briefing, but over to you if you'd like to add.
Sure, thanks, thanks, Juliette. Let me give a few more points then on COVID-19. First, to say that all the countries in the region have obviously been affected, and that COVID-19 has not spared internally displaced or refugees. We've had cases of COVID-19 amongst the internally displaced inside Syria, and amongst the refugees in all of the neighboring countries. Let me just give a couple of numbers for inside Syria. So inside Syria right now, we've got 16,000 confirmed cases through laboratories of COVID-19 and 1,000 associated deaths. And we estimate that that's an underestimate, because the number of COVID-19 cases continue to rise, and there are issues with testing capacity. So clearly the numbers are higher than that. And I think what's important, and the first thing we've done about it, is to continue to emphasize, both in Syria and in neighboring countries, the importance of the physical distancing measures, wearing a mask, washing hands, keeping as conscious of being separate when we're together, meaning at a certain distance, especially with people beyond family and people that we're very close to intimately. And we've had I think a major role there. I think we were able to reach 55 million people within this area with messaging about what to do to protect yourself from COVID. That's been really, really important. Secondly, in terms of what we've been able to do about it, we've been able to focus on making sure that people have trust in services. You've got malnourished children that need immunization. And what we saw initially during COVID-19 was a drop in the number of people, of families, of children using health services. And we were very worried about that because you can then either get sick or die for other reasons and other causes. So we really worked with the authorities in different countries to reestablish contact between the population and the health system. And I'm very glad that immunization has resumed pre-COVID levels. So families are taking their children to be immunized. We now need to do the same with maternal and newborn services. So as women deliver, that they're following up with the health centers. There's ways of doing that safely. And that's why we put such a heavy emphasis on the delivery of PPE kits to frontline workers. The third thing we did is indeed focusing on the issue of learning and supporting countries, as you saw in the video from Jordan, for blended learning. The point that UNICEF makes is a child both needs support with remote learning, so digital access to the materials and the studies, but that's not enough. We're really encouraging blended learning where you come in part of the time in shifts, again, physically distanced, but again, that you're able to have a contact with a teacher or someone who can help you go through some of the materials. And lastly, let me say, there's much more I could point to, work on infection prevention and control, work on psychosocial support. But lastly, let me say, as I said in my remarks, but I think it's important to emphasize, is this focus on making sure that the vaccines are available. So, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, they've had their own bilateral arrangement to get initial vaccines in. As I said, Jordan is among the first countries in the world to vaccinate refugees, and all these countries have included the refugees in their plans, but both for neighboring countries and for Syria itself. They are accessing the COVAX facility, which tries to make sure that vaccines are available to countries in an equitable manner, that we go beyond this vaccine nationalism, which frankly has been a real issue, and that indeed frontline workers first, people with underlying conditions second, the elderly, and then ultimately all of us can have access to vaccines. So, as we speak, the first COVAX deliveries are arriving in Jordan. We have dates for their arrival in Lebanon, in Syria, and Turkey, and the other neighboring countries that have done so much to support Syria refugees.
Thank you, Ted. We have a question from the national newspaper in the UAE from our colleague James Reinl. He's asking, please tell us about Al-Hol camp. We hear shocking stories about foreign fighter children, so mothers of foreign fighters, or wives rather, asking to register children as orphans, which gives them a better chance for getting a home. How do you cope with such awful conditions, and in particular the recent spate of murders and ISIS violence in the camp? That if you can tell us all about your visit specifically. I mean, you're one of the very few people in the world, I would say, that had access to the quote-unquote annex where there are these mothers that James is talking about. Tell us a bit about that.
So let me give you the picture. Al-Hol camp is a camp with 60,000 people, of which 41,000 are children. Of these 41,000 children, 19,000 are Iraqis, 14,000 are Syrian, and about 6,400 are third country nationals. They come from other countries. Those are the ones in the so-called annex. They're in a specific part of the camp. For the camp as a whole, it's you know, a precarious situation. It's a situation that's not fully secure. We're doing our best to provide services, but frankly, this is not where these children and their parents should be. You know, in the main camp, so where the Iraqi and the Syrian children are, there's a full range of services: education, water, health. It's relatively accessible. It's not an easy situation, but it's a situation that we're doing our best to address. In the annex, it's harder because that's where you have the third country national children with their mothers. It's quite a tense situation. We're again providing services when it comes to health, when it comes to water and sanitation. We're working with other agencies on health issues. And we're having a discussion with the mothers about providing the right kind of education and addressing the right kind of education need for the children. The main point we're making is, you know, it's time for the Syrian children to go back to their communities in Syria, and that's happening. Specifically in northeast Syria, we've already seen some Syrians going back. It's time for the Iraqi children and their mothers to go back to Iraq, where you know, if there are procedures from a justice perspective to be addressed against the mothers, then that's what should be done. For the children, they should not be in a justice procedure only by virtue of being part of a family that got caught up in this conflict or that was associated with an armed group or an extremist group. If there's a specific issue a child should done, then they should be allowed to access juvenile justice procedure in their home, in this case, Iraq. And the same is true for the children from the over 60 countries around the world that are in the annex. I have not heard of specifically children being put up as orphans so that they can get back home more easily. We do have, as UNICEF, 2 interim care facilities, interim care centers that have 101 completely unaccompanied children. These are children without mothers or fathers or aunts or uncles in northeast Syria, but they have relatives back home in Central Asia, in North Africa, in Europe, in Asia. And what we're saying specifically is get those kids home first. You know, the interim care center is no place for those children. They don't have relatives there with them, but they have relatives at home. So it's critical that these children get home, and we're advocating with every single member state to take their children home. We understand that when there's a mother present, it's more complex, but even then, our position is take them home and then address whatever issues that the mother needs to address back home. Because the longer they stay in these conditions in the camp, the worse the situation is for those children. And it's very clear, despite the best efforts of humanitarians, you know, many organizations involved, non-governmental organization, UN agencies, despite those best efforts, this is not in the best interest of the children to stay there in the camp.
Thanks, Ted. Ted, there are 2 short questions that I'm going to ask you. One is from Pablo from Radio Estrada, and he's asking if there's been an increase on child labor. I assume he means inside Syria and in the neighboring countries, and I assume it's recent because of COVID and the likelihood of the increases. And then there is a question from Juan Ata. He's from a European radio station. I don't know the abbreviation, but he's asking about the psychological impact the war has had on children.
So thank you for those questions. We have had an increase in child labor. I don't have the exact statistics, and this is something that we continuously look at, but it's very clear that 2 things have happened. One is an increase in child labor as a coping mechanism, and the other one is an increase in child marriage as another coping mechanism. And we're working with families and communities to try to address both. Now, you saw the video from Aleppo and the group of students that were there and everything they were doing, from tailoring to working as carpenters. I've met kids who work in fields in Lebanon picking cucumbers and tomatoes, children working in pastry shops because back home their dad used to work or own a pastry shop. And what we're trying to do is two things. Firstly is try to provide more of a safety net on the families. So our colleagues in WFP are looking at issues of the food security and the food basket, as you heard in my introductory remarks, concern about poverty, concern about the price of the food basket. From our end as UNICEF, we're trying to look at cash transfers, removing barriers to access to education, to health, so that families can have more than one way to address their needs. And both in Lebanon and Jordan, but also inside Syria, some of these cash transfer programs, which frankly are not at the scale that we would like them to, but still what they do is support families to have some cash on hand, some resources to be able then to have more than one coping mechanism. And then when the children are involved in labor, then how do you specifically try to make the case that that labor is not egregious, that it still allows for education and learning? So we heard of the one child that was doing 10 hours of work a day, and then he had cut back to 4. So 4 is okay if the child is 15 or 16 or 17, can help their family, but at the same time still do their learning. So how can we find those kind of solutions, which we understand are sometimes, unfortunately, the reality of the Syrian child? How can we have the hours of learning be such that if you're working in the morning, you can study in the afternoon? So, I mean, those are some of the difficult issues that we have to work with and address. And it's been a real concern. On psychosocial, very good question. And really this last year has been extremely difficult. I mean, it's been the conflict plus the economy, which really has gone into a free fall in Syria. Also, Lebanon is under immense stress. And then COVID, and not being with your friends, not being at school, not being able to circulate. But what we've seen, and again, we're actually going to be doing a more formal report before the end of the month, and hopefully you'll be able to cover that too. But what we've seen is a doubling of reported cases of psychosocial distress in the last year. So 1 in 4 children surveyed inside Syria are facing the psychosocial distress. Overall, as part of a COVID survey in Syria and neighboring countries, anxiety, night terrors, concerns about the future, affected roughly half of children. The issue there for us is how do we support families to deal with this when they themselves are under economic pressure, under economic stress. So, a lot of engagement around positive parenting, what to do with children, hotlines put in place in Lebanon and Jordan and Syria. I'm afraid we're not there yet in terms of scale, but there's a recognition that this is something that needs to be addressed. Thank you.
Thanks. Tell us maybe at the back of that, what is needed? What does UNICEF need to get there?
So look, like every year, we appeal for the resources that we need. Right now, the appeal for the work that we do, the work that you saw globally, is $1.4 billion for the whole of the Syria response. So that's both for Syria and neighboring countries. It's through the generous contribution of governments, individuals, frankly, through the advocacy that you do through the press, that we've been able to sustain the response. And we've tried our best to be, cost effective. So the work on water that you saw in Zatari, for example, it started being water trucking, which is very expensive. We now have a piped system which is, relying on groundwater, which is much cheaper. So over time, we've tried to be more effective, but we need to sustain the response. The humanitarian response is the safety net that the populations both inside Syria and the refugees outside Syria depend on in terms of their well-being. They are enormously resilient. There's so much that they do, and frankly, there's so much that the authorities do as well. But UNICEF, WFP, WHO, UNHCR, the NGOs, the other partners, they do a tremendous job also being there, and the resources are critical. We're also advocating for, firstly, a peaceful solution. What the economy has shown us is there are no winners in this conflict. There needs to be genuine focus on the peace process, the UN-led discussions around the constitution and the way forward politically, that the special envoy, Geir Peterson, is taking. That is the way forward. We're calling for a renewal of the cross-border resolution to allow work to continue into northwest Syria, where 4 million people, 2 million children are depending on the lifeline from cross-border into northwest Syria. And frankly, there are no alternatives to the cross-border resolution. Yes, cross-line helps, but we need cross-line and cross-border. We're calling for support to Syria's neighboring countries and specifically to Lebanon to address the economic situation that it's dealing with. And we're calling for a continuation of a focus on social services. You need to maintain the services in place. So to give you an example, we have over 500,000 children in the Lebanese public education system. That's Syrian and Lebanese children. And that public education system is even more important now as Lebanon's going through its own economic difficulties, both for Syrian and Lebanese children. So to be able to continue to support that system, despite the political difficulties in Lebanon, is critical. And I'm using that as an example, but for you to get the sense. Thanks, Juliette.
Yeah. No, thank you, Ted. Ted, we have 3 questions from our colleague Hiro. He is from TBS Tokyo, a Japanese outlet. And I'm going to ask you the 3 questions because I think they're absolutely critical. The first one is, which areas inside Syria are especially in need for support and why? The second one is, do you, as UNICEF, face any difficulties accessing children in rebel-held territories, and why? And then the third one is about children recruited into the fighting. So if you can give us the latest on that, and what do these specific children use and or need rather in terms of aid? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Juliette. Let me take them in the order in which they were asked. So, firstly, inside Syria, we've got needs throughout the whole country. They're different in different parts of the country, but they're there throughout the whole country. You've got an exhausted population. 90% of Syria's children depend on aid. 80% of Syria's children are below the poverty line. I mean, imagine those numbers, those staggering numbers. And yet, if I were to say what's my area of immediate concern, I would say my area of immediate concern is northwest Syria, where we've had, a population under a lot of pressure. There's been a ceasefire which needs to continue since March, but we've had floods. We've had a very brutal winter. We've had displacement due to the previous fighting, which was never fully addressed. And so it's critical that we also focus attention on the northwest of Syria. It's immediate because we need to be ready for any contingency for the rest of the year related to the cross-border resolution. So while overall we're asking for $1.4 billion, we're specifically asking for an immediate $40 million now for northwest Syria. But frankly, the whole of Syria is at need. In terms of access, I mean, we've had reasonable access to a large part of Syria. There are bureaucratic impediments that occur, but frankly, it's gotten better. We've had a much more robust presence in Kamishli, which is in northeast of Syria, where there's been concerns. There's a banded territory around Deir ez-Zor, which is not easily accessible because it's in the hands of armed groups that have an extremist bent. And of course, we continue to be concerned about being able to access northwest Syria, as I mentioned, through the cross-border resolution accurately. So there are pockets around Deir ez-Zor in the northwest, around the Afrin area that we need to continue to work and advocate for better access. But there are different ways through local organizations, through third-party monitors that we do our best. And what we as UNICEF cannot do, there are NGOs that also do their work cross-border, cross-line, through different modalities. On the children that are recruited into fighting. So we, over the last 10 years, have maintained a mechanism. It's called the monitoring and reporting mechanism that monitors the situation of grave violations. And the grave violations are Security Council violations that look at children affected by armed conflict, from recruitment to killing and maiming children, to attacks on hospitals and health facilities, to denial of access, to abduction. And our statistics show that 5,737 children, some as young as 7, as I said, have been recruited by, frankly, all the parties to the conflict in Syria. And we have been negotiating and talking to the different parties so that they do their part, both to release those children that are still with them, but also that they refrain from recruitment, whatever the reason is. Sometimes a 17-year-old or a 16-year-old may say, I want to join this group or that group because I believe in the cause. Sometimes they're taken forcibly. The whole range of rationales, whatever the reason, it's not a place of a child to be in an armed group. And so we're working towards that. What is also true, and I think that's behind your question, is that once the child's returned, they need a lot of support. And that's a really important part of the process. It's the whole reintegration of that child, the psychosocial support they need. They need to rediscover how to be a child. They need to re-access learning. They need to re-access education and that sense of normalcy that comes from being a child. Right now, again, our main concern is in northwest Syria. 75% of the violations in 2020 were in the northwest of Syria. And so that continues to be where we're concerned in terms of issues of recruitment specifically. And that's going to be a big part of our focus in 2021.
Great, thank you, Ted. A number of you colleagues are asking how to use the videos that we used in both the field trip, the virtual field trip, both to Jordan and to Syria, and also to the 10-10-10, which includes interviews with children that we've been working with for the past 10 years. So all of this can be downloaded and used from our website. After this press briefing, we will be sharing a recording of this press briefing and also a link to all the multimedia material with colleagues from UNICEF who are able to give you high quality material, including for the use in broadcast. So please stay tuned. If you're not on our mailing list, please send us in the chat box your email address and we will add you to our mailing lists. And if you'd like, we also have a WhatsApp group. So you can send us your WhatsApp number and we add it. And it is a silent WhatsApp group. So it's a broadcast, so there's no chit chat. So don't worry about any noise. Ted, are you ready for the second question? Next question?
Sure.
Okay, so we have a question from our colleague Tom. He's in the Independent newspaper in the UK. And he says it has been reported that the UK government is considering cutting aid to Syria by 2/3 from 137 million British pounds last year to just over 45 million this year, as well as to other countries such as Yemen. What is UNICEF's reaction to that? You may recall we've seen this story in the BBC about that, where also they mention, in addition to Syria, Lebanon. What do you have to tell us, Ted, on that one?
So firstly, Tom, let me say this is as we understand that it's not official. It needs to be confirmed. And I think that would be the first thing to say is it's a report. Clearly, we need to hear officially if that's the case. And if it were the case, obviously it would be of concern. But I also want to say that the UK has been one of UNICEF's largest donors globally and is one of the top UNICEF donors in the Syria crisis. You know, since 2013, the UK has been hugely generous, given nearly $500 million of in US dollars, that is, of assistance to UNICEF for the response both inside Syria and in neighboring countries. It's allowed us to make a huge difference, as you saw on the videos. So very much hoping that this is, you know, part of a discussion, but that is in fact not confirmed as it comes out. And indeed, for all donors, for the UK, for all the donors that have been so generous, you know, the Gulf countries, the neighboring countries, you know, investing now in this crisis and continuing to invest makes a difference. It avoids a lost generation. It makes sure that children don't experience and therefore end up acting out the worst. And I think it's extremely important that we stay the course. Again, the UK has been so generous. We've got to believe that they will continue to be supportive and continue to support the response in Syria, in Yemen, and elsewhere.
Thanks, Ted. Ted, there is a question also from the national newspaper, and then related another question also on education. The latter is in fact about education inside Syria and schools inside Syria. So that's a question. And then the other question relates to the 5 million kids who are inside Syria and in neighboring countries who continue to have access to learning. And the question is related to the funding that UNICEF is asking for to continue to keep these children in learning. Over to you.
Can you repeat the first question, Juliet? I didn't get the first question.
Yeah, the first question was about education inside Syria, Ted, and the schools inside Syria, and what is it? What is the big picture, if you wish, on education inside Syria?
The big picture on education inside Syria. Okay.
All right.
So firstly, let me say that each of these 5 million children is a ray of hope. You know, when we meet these children, I was before I went to Northeast Syria in December, right before the pandemic started, so a year ago basically, I was in the southern part of Idlib province, and we saw a school in a small village. You know, you go through that part of the country and it's mainly deserted villages, but there was this one little school which had brought together children who had been refugees in Lebanon, children who had been internally displaced, and children who had never left. And it was about 200 children studying and, you know, being children. And it was just so powerful to see those kids, because each of them basically represents someone who is investing in their future. And, you know, 5 million of these children exist today. So, you know, we still have a huge amount of work to do. There's still, while there's 5 million children in school, there's 3.2 million children out of school, both inside Syria and in neighboring countries. And really, you know, I mentioned the $1.4 billion that we're appealing to this year. The vast majority of that, 700 million, a bit less than 700 million of that 1.4 is for education, because we recognize what Syrian mothers recognize. which is this is the most important thing we can do. Inside Syria, this is both formal and non-formal education. I think that goes to your question. It's a kind of catch-up learning that you saw in the video from Aleppo, where it's a second chance education. You can come back to learning and either at least get some skills or actually get back into the formal education system. It's self-learning materials that go throughout the country, including in territory that's not held by the central authorities in Damascus. And we're just saying, let's have as many channels of learning and let's support those channels of learning. Because again, that's what mothers are saying gives them hope in terms of their children. I think Juliet, the second question was around the appeal. I didn't write it down. Is that correct?
The second question was about, the first one was about the 5 million kids and how, I think you covered it actually, Eitan. The second question was about the situation of schools inside Syria. Can they be used or not? And that I think you've also covered.
Maybe to add that about a third of the schools in Syria have been damaged, destroyed, are used by IDPs, or are used, frankly, for military purposes, and that's part of what we track and advocate for the return of those schools to learning purposes. But again, learning can occur in a community center, like you saw in Aleppo. It can occur under a tree. It can occur formally or non-formally. So it is important that the infrastructure is there. It is important even more that students have access to the learning materials, to the teachers, and the support to get to exams, all of which UNICEF works on, both inside Syria and in neighboring countries. I mentioned the Lebanese education system, the public education system, which is so critical to provide a chance for Syrian children to study, but also, frankly, increasingly to Lebanese children who cannot afford to be in a private school. And then, we've invested heavily, and there are issues with management, there are issues with the politics in Lebanon, but frankly, it's essential that that system continue to be there. What we're seeing from Morocco to Lebanon as the COVID crisis has hit us is more and more children coming back to the public education system because that's a system that they can afford. Families are having to make hard choices. They don't have the resources often to keep their children in private school when they're figuring out where the next meal is going to come from.
Thanks, Ted. Then there are two questions on the COVID-19. One specifically asks about COVID-19 in refugee camps and among refugees, which I think you covered, but if you'd like to say something else, including on when the vaccine, assuming COVID vaccine will reach them. So that's one. And related to that is a journalist from TSF radio in Portugal. She's asking that she spoke to an aid organization, and they told her that the situation of COVID inside Syria is not very bad. What do you have to say to that? So the second question is from Portugal. The first question is, by the way, from a Rai newspaper in Kuwait.
Okay, thank you very much, Juliet. So on the first question, let me perhaps be precise about what I said earlier. Firstly, is that all the countries, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, have submitted vaccination plans that includes the refugees. And that's really important because they've recognized what we all recognize, which is no one is safe until everyone is safe. As I said, Jordan, among the first people vaccinated in Jordan, there was symbolically some refugees being vaccinated. Again, according to the priority list, frontline workers, the elderly, people with underlying conditions, etc. But what's important is that in the operationalization of these plans, that spirit continues to be the case. And I think Jordan is the farthest along in terms of immunization, but in no countries have we yet seen, scale in terms of everyone reaching vaccines. As I said, Jordan is moving quite well, but in all cases, I think part of our dialogue with the authorities, our support in terms of COVAX, our support in terms of there's something called the humanitarian buffer, is going to be to make sure that there is an equitable distribution of vaccine within the population, again, according to the country's own prioritization and ranking, and that the refugees are not treated differently or separately. Now, frankly, that's something that we'll need to continue to work on and advocate. Equally, it's important that vaccine nationalism doesn't continue to prevail, where we have rich countries having, more than, the population's need in vaccines. And that's indeed where COVAX comes in, where the COVAX facility comes in, where the work that WHO, UNICEF, Gavi, and others, the World Bank and others are doing to make sure that that's the case. It's a work in progress. I can't give you something more specific at this stage because the vaccines are only arriving this month, essentially, from COVAX, in addition to whatever the governments have arranged bilaterally in the case of the neighboring countries. And just finally, let me say that within Syria, we're keeping an equal eye on making sure that the Northeast and the Northwest get their share, and working both with the Ministries of Health, but also in the case of the Northwest as a completely separate application to make sure that that's the case. On the question of the status of COVID within Syria, as I said, the reality is that first of all, COVID is it's a global pandemic. It's a problem everywhere. Everyone's been impacted by COVID. The issue is, in many parts of Syria, you may not have the testing capacity to be able to confirm it's COVID. So I would never say that COVID is not serious in Syria. Syria has many issues, but COVID is one of them. And I think what we can do is to continue to make the case to follow social, or rather physical, distancing measures, wear the masks, wash your hands, be careful when you're in groups, keep 2 meters between yourselves, be conscious that this is a real disease that kills people. And then, use the health centers. Don't be afraid to use the services that are there. Check in if you're not feeling well, because early detection is the best way to ensure early recovery. And then next, as I mentioned to our Kuwaiti colleague, get prepared for vaccination. Let's fight this vaccine hesitancy. Getting vaccination is part of the solution. These are vaccines that have gone through rigorous testing. If you are called to be vaccinated, if you're part of the category of priorities, by all means, take your vaccine. Vaccination is one of the most effective public health measures that we have for COVID and for the major killers of children, the major diseases that kill children.
Great, thank you. Ted, do you want to tell us a little bit about that? Your last point, vaccination of children. How has that impacted during COVID? I know it's a bit of a diversion from Syria, but when it comes to routine immunization, because someone asked about it in the chat, how has that been impacted by COVID?
So, throughout the Middle East and North Africa, as I had indicated, we had seen a significant sharp drop in the utilization of health services because people were afraid. People were afraid of going out. People were afraid of going into health facilities. Health workers themselves were afraid of going to health facilities. So I think we worked on 3 levels. One is to get accurate information about how to what to be afraid of and what not to be afraid of. Second, we supported countries to get PPEs to frontline health workers, and not just frontline health workers that were working on COVID, but frontline health workers that were part of the primary healthcare system, the health posts, the health centers that provide vaccination, that provide public health services. Thirdly, we actually helped, it was quite creative, we helped provide training, WHO, UNICEF working together to provide training to health workers as to how to minimize contact. So if a child's coming in and they're malnourished, we actually developed a mid-upper arm circumference bracelet that the mother could administer. So the health workers didn't have to touch the child. The mother could use the MUAC to measure the nutritional status of the child and reduce contacts, so that you had trust that if you came in, you'd get the solution without necessarily being exposed. Same with immunization and other, you know, how to minimize the number of steps that required contact. And I think as a result of all this, as a result of advocacy, we relied on ministers, on public figures, on religious leaders to encourage people to start going back to the health system. You know, whereas at one point we had seen a 30 to 40% drop in immunization level, we're almost back to pre-COVID levels now in most countries. And that's really, really positive. Where we now need to do more work, as I said earlier, is on maternal and newborn care services. So when the mom is pregnant, that she goes into the health center to get a checkup. When the child is born, that the child gets brought in to get their checkup. So, you know, again, slowly, that trust is being reestablished. We're really glad that on immunization in particular, that has been restored. And I have to say, throughout the crisis, despite COVID, you know, when there were no flights, we did everything possible to arrange for the vaccines to get to places like Yemen and Syria, sometimes using really innovative flight routes and flight patterns. So at the very least, you know, vaccines against measles were there, vaccines against polio were there. And I'm very proud to say that we did not have an interruption in the vaccine supply in any of the countries that asked us to help during this crisis.
Fantastic, thank
Middle
you.
East and North Africa, yeah.
Thank you. If we go back to Syria, and in particular to Syrian refugees, we have another question from Tom in The Independent. He's asking about the possibility of the return of Syrian families from neighboring countries back into Syria, and if yes or no, what does the future hold for these children, for children who live now as refugees in Syria's neighboring countries?
So a couple of things. I think the United Nations position is that return has to be safe, dignified, and voluntary. We're seeing small numbers of people returning, but the vast majority of refugees are going to make their own choices. And you know, I think the United Nations position is that it depends on the individual family's decision based on those criteria. What we are seeing, however, and this is important, is hundreds of thousands of internally displaced going home. You know, that's frankly critical. And I can give you an example of when I was in Eastern Ghouta, in the outskirts of Damascus, again, right before the COVID crisis, at the, you know, a little over a year ago. And you know, we were seeing families going back to homes which were, you know, half bombed out. And they're, you know, using the latitude that we have with humanitarian infrastructure. UNICEF was laying down pipes, water pipes, so water was accessible. Schools were being patched up. It's important to repair schools. You know, you don't want the roof collapsing on a child so that when they're learning. You know, providing psychosocial support. You know, we need to reestablish basic services using that window. So that families can go back to their homes of origin from within Syria. So, you know, HCR can give you the exact number of refugees coming back from neighboring countries. You know, I just listed the criteria that the UN generally calls for that return to happen. It's equally important that we recognize that there's hundreds of thousands of internally displaced that are returning home. And that the support that they need to be able to do that is there and in place.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Ted. I think we covered most of the questions, if not all of them, that came to the Q&A box. So I'm just, since we have you for another 20 minutes, I'm just asking colleagues who are on the line with us if they want to ask anything else. If not, then we will thank you very much and sign off. So let's wait just maybe for a few minutes. And the Unicef colleagues behind the scenes, if there's who've been helping with this event, if there's any questions that I've missed, please send them to me. And I think we covered them all.
Okay, Juliet. Well, listen, I want to thank all the members of the press that have been with us here today. It's so important that you continue to focus our attention on Syrian children and their needs. We have to stay the course. We have to be there with this generation of Syrian children, which frankly is the hope for the country, in terms of the future. And I'd like to thank all those UNICEF colleagues behind the scenes that have made this happen. These are not usual times for these kind of conferences, press conferences. So I'm glad that we're able to do this today.
Thank you, Ted, and big thanks to the colleagues as well who put this together. And thank you all for coming to our press conference. And hopefully next year it will not be about Syria, and it will be in person about something very positive in this region. We look forward to staying in touch. And until then, you can stay with us for a few more minutes. We will run some of our videos. Thank you again. Have a good evening, good day, wherever you are. Stay safe and see you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.